Good evening and welcome to Hemispheres. My name's Richard Curtis and I'll be your host this evening. And joining us this evening by phone, we have Professor Ravi Batra of Southern
Hello?
Methodist University. Are you there?
Hello.
Hello. Whoop.
Hello?
Hello.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Batra is the author of a new book, The Great Depression of 1998 and 99.
Oh, actually, it's the stock market crashes of '98 and '99.
Oh, okay. Well, we should get that correct. And in
And
addition,
the subtitle is "The Asian Crisis and Your Future."
and I understand that you have just returned from Japan, where you've been looking into these things quite directly.
Yeah, I went there during the spring break, and what I saw was full confirmation of what has been appearing in the newspapers, that things have fallen apart in Asia already, and then they're spreading to Japan now. Their banks now have foreign loans, bad foreign loans, in addition to bad domestic loans. And unemployment is rising, and on top of it, prices are beginning to fall actually. And that's a real bad sign, because when prices begin to fall, profits fall, and that means businesses have to lay off even more workers. If Japan falls as badly as South Korea and the rest of the tigers have, then pretty soon the crisis will spread over the world, I think.
And you obviously wrote the book before this visit, at least. What was it that you were seeing that was motivating you to anticipate
Well,
such dire events?
I have been writing about economic conditions and future of the world economy and society ever since 1978, actually. At that time, I had published a book called The Downfall of Capitalism and Communism. And I had predicted that both systems would collapse by the year 2000. And Soviet communism, and that's what I had predicted, that that Soviet communism would collapse by the year 2000. And that has already gone right before our eyes. And now I think it's the turn of the rule of money in society. By capitalism, I mean it's the rule of money in society, and I think the rule of money in society is now going to collapse. And events seem to be appearing there on time, with Asia and Japan in turmoil, and the U.S. stock market rising so fast that people can't even explain why it's rising. And I think any kind of stock market crash today, with millions of Americans involved in it, would quickly lead to a downfall of the system in which money rules society, money rules politics, and the laws, and all sorts of things. And when the rule of money falls, I think we will have a very good new system. And so I'm predicting a golden age in the future, but for about three to 5 years, we could see economic turmoil in America and the rest of the world.
Well, perhaps you could explain a little bit about how you and how economists generally understand money and the function of money.
The function of money, well, everything in the world, especially in the economic world, is governed by two forces: the forces of supply and demand. It's as simple as that. And supply is connected to productivity of the people. When people produce things, goods are supplied. And demand comes from wages. The main source of consumer demand is people's salaries. So when wages rise in proportion to productivity, then there is a rough balance between supply and demand, because productivity is connected to supply, wages are connected to demand. And wages lag behind productivity, and that is what has been happening all over the world, then supply grows faster than demand. That's the situation that we have now in Asia and Japan. Asian tigers and Japan. Wages have lagged behind sharply their productivity levels, so there's too much supply in those countries, but not enough demand. And that supply is going to come to the American shores, which will mean there will be too much supply in America, and whenever there is excessive supply, prices fall. And that's what's happening in Japan. That's beginning to happen in America now. We keep hearing every day that gasoline prices keep falling. One reason they are falling, well, there is not enough demand for gasoline in Asia now. So gasoline prices fall. Many petroleum companies will have to lay off workers. Some other prices are also falling, and that's the biggest danger to the world economy today, which we have not seen since the 1930s. That's the last time when prices fell, and that led to a huge disaster.
What then is the connection with a money economy?
Well, when productivity grows too fast and wages don't grow enough, that means who is getting the fruit of productivity? That means profits rise too fast. So too much money is then accumulated in very few hands. When profits rise very fast, wages don't, then a lot of money is accumulated in very few hands, and that means the rich get richer, and when the rich then put their money in the stock market, because they want, by nature, a millionaire is not satisfied with a small return. A millionaire does not care for another $10,000 or $50,000. He wants more millions, and such returns are available only from speculative investments like stock market. So much money that goes into the stock market. That's one reason why stock prices go up sharply whenever profits grow faster than wages. And another function of money is that money can be printed by the governments themselves. And over the past 10, 15 years, especially Japan has been printing a lot of money to keep its economy afloat. But the thing is, inside Japan, there are not many investment opportunities. So a lot of Japanese money has been coming into America, and it has been going into Asian tigers. So one reason why stock prices rose very sharply all over the world is this Japanese money. And now a lot of banks in Japan have bad loans from Asia, and that's another problem for the Japanese markets. So money can play a very strong role in the stock market. It can also play a strong role in profits and wages and so on.
Well, and there's something very interesting in what you said, because the conventional wisdom around the stock market would be that if prices are going up and the stock market itself is increasing in value, that's a good thing. And you're suggesting that can in fact be a significant sign of very bad things.
Yeah, if prices, that's right. If the stock market rises in proportion to the rest of the economy, then it's fine. A rough balance is maintained in the economy. But when stock prices rise too fast because of expanding money supply and because of wages lagging behind productivity, then a point comes when there is not enough demand in the economy. There is too much supply, too much production, and not even enough consumer demand. That's when profits begin to fall, because businesses can't sell all that they have invested in. So then profits begin to fall, and when profits begin to fall, stock markets crash. They have crashed in Asia and Japan, and my feeling is that in a few months, the Asian troubles are going to come to the United States, and they're going to crash here as well.
I think we need to spend a little time on the factors that are happening in the moment that you're seeing that motivate that prediction. But what was it that was behind your saying that capitalism as a system would end, all those decades ago when you first said that?
Well, I have seen. That book was a book of history in which I had studied 5,000 years of human history, and I found that whenever money ruled society, and this is not the first time that wealth or money have ruled society in America. There have been other times in world history when similar conditions prevailed. For instance, feudalism. In the case of feudalism, wealth in the form of land ruled society. So I found that whenever there were systems in which wealth was the dominant factor in society, then there was a tremendous jump in the concentration of wealth in the economy and the nation. And as wealth concentration jumped, there was a lot of speculation. Also, uh, people became extremely materialistic. Crime went up, divorce went up, family ties broke down. So I wrote in my book that as time passes, we will see these things happening. We will see a big rise in crime, divorce, and the drop in family ties. We would also see tremendous rise in wealth concentration. And if these things start happening, and then speculation also starts rising, then for sure the rule of money or capitalism this time would end. And so I have been watching with great interest the rise in crime and divorce and the drop in family ties and also the rising concentration of wealth, and now, above all, the huge stock market gain, which is speculation. So I think that we are very close to a stock market crash, which most likely would be followed by the end of the rule of money in society.
Now, you're not the first person to predict that eventuality.
No, I'm not the first person, but I'm the well, whether fortunately or unfortunately, I'm the only person to predict that both systems would collapse by the
Right.
year 2000.
Well, what I was getting at was that Marx wrote about this,
Right,
and he
exactly.
called it the crisis of overproduction.
Right.
What is the relationship between what he was saying then, 150 years ago, and what you're saying now?
The difference is that he was somewhat biased toward a communist state or a state-owned society, economy or state monopolies. He felt that state monopolies would be very efficient and they would work for the workers, and the workers' living standard would rise substantially, whereas the living standard would fall, would continue, progressively fall in the capitalist economies. But I think I'm somewhat more objective. I looked at what was happening under Soviet communism and even Chinese communism, and predicted that Soviet communism and its satellites were going to go down by the year 2000, while Chinese communism, if it remained communism at all, would stay healthy. And so I looked at all sorts of economic conditions, communism and capitalism, whereas Marx had a biased analysis. His economic analysis, in some cases, was very sound. For instance, that there could be overproduction in the capitalist world, and that could cause depression and stock market crashes. But what he forgot was that there were a lot of problems with the communist economic system as well, and so he thought communism was the final state of social evolution, whereas in my analysis there is no final state. Things keep on moving all the time, and every system comes and goes, and then a new system is born. And fortunately, because of human and social evolution, the new system is better than the old system.
By what standard?
First of all, there is more compassion in society, more caring, and living standard is also higher. more human rights, democracy, less authoritarianism, and so on. From all these standards, I think new systems are better than the old.
And you see that change as being sort of a quantum leap.
Yes, first that side. After each, first there is a lot of pain in when a system begins to fall, but after that pain there is a quantum jump, and we have a new system. For instance, I think in the future, instead of monopoly capitalism that we have today, we will have economic democracy, in which where workers, employees will own the majority shares of a company, and their representatives will manage the factories. And in this kind of system, there will be a lot more equality among in wages and incomes and wealth than we have today.
Well,
And an example of economic democracy today would be, for instance, United Airlines, which I think majority of the shares are owned by employees. And this is one company which has not downsized, by the way. All big companies have downsized, but not United Airlines at all.
well, okay. Leaving behind problems that would have to do with nation states that manifest in the Soviet Union, it sounds very similar, though, what you're saying and what Marx said about employee ownership.
Well, employee ownership is not what Marx said. Marx would say state ownership, the state working in the interest of the employees, but still it is state monopoly. What I'm talking about essentially is mass capitalism, that shares are not owned by, shares are not mainly in the hands of a few people, but they are owned by a huge number of people, and they control their own destiny. So this is a private property, private ownership, versus Marx, who was talking about state ownership and the state working in the interest of the workers, which, as we have seen from experience, has not happened and did not happen.
You referred to representatives of the workers.
Right.
That's the part that
Like the
sounds
workers
like the
would
state.
elect their own board of directors, and the board of directors then appoint managers to run the factory. That's what's happening in United Airlines. So this board of directors represents the interests of the workers rather than who are the major shareholders anyway. And the board of directors nowadays mostly represent the interests of the management. And that's why the top managers earn millions and millions of dollars, whereas employees some of them have seen their wages falling even at this time.
And you do not see a particular impact in the structure of government of the nation state.
There would be some change in the governing of the nation state. For instance, right now, money plays a tremendous role in elections. When the new system takes place, money will have no role at all. People would be elected on the basis of their merits, whether whatever merit they have, intellectual or business expertise, or skills in army, any kind of skills. So people would be elected on the basis of their merit rather than how much money they can raise or how much money they have. So that will be a tremendous improvement, because money in the end tends to corrupt the politicians, and it tends to corrupt the system. And that's the big problem in Asia right now, that they're calling it crony capitalism, that this crony capitalism caused a fall of the stock market and their banking system. Whereas in America also we have crony capitalism, because the multinational corporations, big corporations can buy off politicians and have tax laws, especially tax laws, passed in their favor. And that creates problems in the end. First, there is a huge stock market gain from this system. In the end, there is crash, and then there are major changes in society.
Well, certainly there are a lot of people, well, maybe not relatively a lot, but it's relatively a small number of people who have a very strong interest in maintaining the system the way it is. And
Yes,
surely,
well, that's why I found in that book, which I wrote in 1978, that no matter how powerful a system was, how strong a system was, that whenever the elites became very exploitative of the poor and the middle class, and an example of exploitation would be you reduce your own taxes and raise the taxes of others. That is tremendous exploitation in society. So whenever this kind of thing happened, then something occurred in society that overthrew the rule of those elites and brought changes in government. And no matter how powerful the government was, there was the change in society either through evolution or through revolution. And for instance, when I predicted in 1978 that Soviet communism was destined to fall, many of my friends and critics said, how is that possible? Because the Soviet Union has a lot of atom bombs, hydrogen bombs, missiles. Who is going to bring them down? And I said to them, I think this is a pattern of nature. This is part of nature. Nature would bring them down because they are exploiting their people. There's tyranny in the Soviet system, and the nature won't tolerate it forever. And I was looking, from my calculations, I thought the major change would occur by the year 2000.
and let's give this a little more meat, and talk about some of the details that were behind your most recent book. I mean, what?
Right. Again, the title of the most recent book is Stock Market Crashes of 1998 and 1999, and the subtitle is The Asian Crisis and Your Future. So what I'm saying here is, when you watch many of the money shows on TV, what you hear from the experts is that the fundamentals of the economy is extremely sound, and therefore that justifies the huge jump in the stock market. Now, let's see what kind of fundamentals they talk about. According to them, we now have very low inflation rate, very low interest rates, and very low level of unemployment. So inflation, interest rate, and unemployment are their fundamentals. Unemployment is what, about 4.5%, very low, and interest rates are about 6-7%, and inflation rate is about 2% a year. So these are the fundamentals that they look at, and it sounds great, except until you remember the year 1929. At that time, these fundamentals were even more attractive, with unemployment being 3%. Just 3% of the labor force was unemployed at that time. Inflation was practically zero, no inflation at all, and interest rates were only 4%. So you had the best possible economy, best possible fundamental in the year 1929, and yet the stock market crashed and the Great Depression occurred. And so it's clear then that these are not the fundamentals. The fundamentals are the forces of supply and demand. And if there is imbalance in supply and demand, then no matter how low inflation, unemployment, interest rates are, the markets are going to crash. And that's what we have today. We have too much supply, especially in Asia, including Japan, and not enough demand because there is tremendous inequality in the world. So because of excessive supply, I think prices will fall, and falling prices mean deflation, and deflation have always led to stock market crashes in the past, at least.
How is it that we came to be in this situation? Probably the same factors were not the same, for example, in 1970, but yet they are becoming exacerbated, as you're pointing out today. And why did that happen?
I think our system, our democratic system, is such that that money dominates politics, and when money dominates politics, the tax laws and laws of regulation and competition, antitrust, etc., are so manipulated that the rich should get richer. For instance, I hear again and again from economists as well as politicians saying that when you reduce the income tax rate, growth rate rises. I've heard it from so many people, and perhaps you have too, that when you reduce taxes, income taxes, then investment goes up, and so economic growth benefits. And when I look at history, in the 1950s and the 1960s, economic growth was practically twice as high as the 1990s. And what was the income tax rate in the 50s and the 60s? Nobody believes. The top bracket income tax rate was as high as 90%. And that was the income tax rate, and the growth rate was much higher than it is today. So there's a lot of misinformation simply because money rules politics and society. And so when money rules politics and societies, tax laws and other laws are passed in such a way that makes the rich richer. And when the concentration of wealth rises, the first effect is always a big jump in the stock market. And then the all stock market bubbles have burst in the past, because that's the nature of the bubble. When it expands too fast, the rest of the economy does not expand fast enough, it has to burst. And so we are in the same situation today that we were in 1929. And by the way, what is again intriguing is that we have heard of all these currency devaluations occurring in Asia recently. Well, the first time that this kind of situation occurred was in 1928. There was currency devaluation in Latin America and Australia, and that caused prices to fall around the world. In the end, the stock markets crashed. So we are somewhat in the same position now that we were in 1929. And the reason then as now is that money rules society, and as a result, concentration of wealth has been rising. And first there is euphoria, and eventually there is pain.
So it sounds like, more simply put, you might say it's the operation of greed over time.
That's right. It's the operation of greed over time. And then we learn also, for instance, when the Great Depression occurred in the 30s, all sorts of laws were passed to control greed. That's why we had this. The top bracket income tax rate was as high as 90%, because we learned that the end result of greed was extremely painful. So this income tax rate was very high. Banks were very tightly regulated so that they won't abuse other people's money. And so the economy was much stronger in the 50s and the 60s. Then, as time passed, a new generation took over. They did not have much memory of the Depression. And again, the rule of money takes over, or took over, and same kind of laws were passed in the 80s and the 90s. And now we are back to the same situation, except that it's much worse now. The rise of the stock market is much worse this time, in percentage terms as well as in absolute terms, than it ever was in the 20s. So this type of situation is very dangerous.
And your anticipation of what's liable to come out of that is different than what came out of it in the 1930s.
Yes, this time I think the rule of money will be overthrown because the pain would be a lot worse. Look at it this way. This index called the Dow Jones Index of 30 stocks, which is well known around the world. This was first calculated in 1885. That's the year when the Dow Jones Index was first calculated. Then, at the end of 1982, it passed the figure of 1,000. So the Dow Jones Index passed 1,000. So it took about a century before the Dow crossed 1,000. And then between 1982 and now 1998, in the next 16 years, it went past 8,500. I mean, just see how much is the incredible jump in the stock market. And I think all sorts of laws of nature have been violated this time. So the pain would be much worse, but therefore the end result would also be much better.
I should take just a moment here to... Why is it simply the action of greed over time that means it has gotten so much worse? Or is there something else going on that it is this much worse than it was in 28?
Well, I think there is something else going on too, because as I've written before in my book, The Downfall of Capitalism and Communism, written in 78, there is a law of nature, that nature overthrows the ruling elites when they become extremely exploitative. And the overthrow of the system means it has to go to much greater extremes than in the past, because people don't like radical change. So when radical change is about to happen, then nature brings about changes which are simply not easy to explain. And that's why I think this time the rise of the Dow is simply beyond any historical comparison. It just boggles my mind when I find that the rest of Asia is in recession, and then unemployment keeps rising there, profits are falling, whereas the Wall Street is simply rising, still breaking records. They seem to be in a state of denial, and nothing seems to be affecting them. So I think that there is some kind of natural force which is simply pushing these prices up and up through the mechanism of the markets, of course. But then there will be a big fall, and that I think will lead to catastrophic results, at least for the people. Although eventually we'll have a better system, but for 4 or 5 years we'll have a lot of pain.
I've read that there are people, professional money managers on Wall Street who also are looking at the global situation at the moment and suggesting that deflation is the necessary logical outcome. Was that also true in 28?
Oh, yes.
That people were saying that?
Level of deflation occurred then.
No, I mean, were there people in 28 saying that something bad's going to happen?
Yes. That's exactly... well, they were in the minority. Most people, including economists and politicians, believed that the stock prices would keep rising forever. The most well-known remark about stock market came from the world-famous economist from Yale University. His name was Irving Fisher. And I think it was perhaps around 22nd of October, 1929, that he said, stock prices in America have reached a permanently high plateau. And a week later, the crash occurred, and never to return to original position again. So there were some people who warned that devaluations were occurring in Latin America and Australia, and they said that the effect in about a year or two would be deflation, which in the end could be catastrophic, but nobody paid attention to them at that time.
Just in theory, if we were to have an incident that was dramatic, like October 29, 1929, what would be the response of government?
The government would try to do what they are trying in the economies of Asian tigers. Uh, excuse me. The IMF is trying to bail out many of these countries by giving them loans. But who will bail out the United States? Well, the U.S. Federal Reserve System would try to bring interest rates down and pump more money into the banking system, and the government would increase spending, and the budget deficit would sharply rise to counter the impact of falling stock markets. So that will be their response, and I think it would work for a little while, but so much money is now involved in the stock market that I don't think they will be able to do it any more than a band-aid uh, help. They want to be really able to stop the hemorrhaging.
I want to come back to some of those thoughts, but I wonder what has been the response in the economic profession, the economics community, to your work.
Uh, well, very few of them are aware of my work. They're aware of my work dealing with the prophecy of depressions, but they are not aware of my earlier work about the prophecy of the downfall of capitalism and communism. So when they hear about that, their main reaction is, well, at least capitalism has not fallen, so I'm only half 50% right. And, uh, and then I tend to ask them, even if it is 50% right, that forecast was so startling and far-fetched to begin with, even that should give me some credibility. But economists generally tend to discount the possibility of another depression because they think that the governments can stop these events now, which they could not in the 30s. And so they don't really believe that another depression is possible, although some might think that stock market could go down somewhat in the event there is deflation. But my response is that the economists did not predict the Asian crisis either, and they did not predict the downfall of Soviet communism also. So I'm sticking to my forecast.
And these mechanisms that they would be referring to would be computer holds that are put on trading when stocks move too far in one direction or another, that kind of thing?
No, that is simply a stopgap measure. In fact, some people think that if you bring about a temporary halt to the trading, that can make things even worse because if people want to sell stock and they are not allowed to, then there's frustration, and the next time the market opens, there is a much bigger fall. So, not that. I think when economists say that the governments can stop this kind of event now, they mostly refer to the Federal Reserve System and the fact that the governments now increase the budget deficit to fight a recession, whereas in the past they simply would stand idly by, won't do anything, and hoping that the economy would work itself out. This time, nowadays, the governments take much active role, and they try to do something about a faltering economy. So that's what they refer to the fact that the Fed chairman could bring interest rates down, and the government would sharply raise its budget deficit to fight a recession. So they think the governments can now stop a slide.
And those are the mechanisms that John Maynard Keynes was referring to.
That's right, and Those are the mechanisms that we have been constantly using, uh, whether in good times or bad times, and so far there has not been a really bad depression. There were some serious recessions, for instance, from 73 to 75, and then 1980 to 82, but we haven't had the calamity of the 1930s, that kind of depression.
And why is it that you see this happening over a time frame of months as opposed to years?
Well, it is another phenomenon that I have observed, and that is, at least in this century, dramatic and destructive events have been happening in the last year of a decade. I don't know why. Maybe nature is giving a signal for the next decade, but the last year of a decade has been usually very destructive. For instance, we already know about 1929, and then let's think of 1939. That's the start of the Second World War. That's the year. Then you look at 1949. That's the year of Chinese Revolution and the great massacre that occurred in China that year. And then 1959 is the year of the Cuban Revolution. In 1969, inflation began to rise sharply and then afflicted the whole world in the 1970s. Then 1979 is the year of revolution in Iran. 1989, I'm sure you remember that, is the year of the fall of the Berlin Wall. So what is now 1999? That's just a year away. So I think that's the year of the fall of the rule of money in America and in the capitalist society. So that's why I feel that we are not that far away from another destructive event.
That's actually a very chilling litany of the 20th century when you put it all together like that.
But isn't it right?
Well, that's why it's chilling.
Yeah.
All those things you're saying are true.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's why I feel that it's coming soon, and maybe you might tell your readers about my 800 number where they can get a copy of this book now.
Well, yeah. Why don't we do that since you brought that, listeners?
Yeah.
But go ahead. What's that number?
It's 1-800-888-9999. Very easy to remember. 800-888-9999.
Well, if we're gonna give people news that's this bad, maybe we should talk a little bit about what are you doing to be prepared? What should people do?
I went to Japan to give them advice how they could bring their economy out, and also people can do something for their own finances. So the nation can do something, and also the people can do something. And I guess at this point we should talk about what the public can do. And I suggest that a lot of people have made a lot of money in stock market, and I don't think there will be one great stock market crash this time. We will have a series of mini crashes, so that one crash occurs, and then, suppose the market falls by, say, 10%. That's the kind of stock market crash, but still a mini crash. When this happens, definitely start selling your stocks and get into either short-term government bonds or short-term bank CDs, because since you've already made a lot of money, why not just secure those gains and get out of a risky situation and get into short-term bank CDs or short-term government bonds. These are the two things actions I recommend to the people.
Now, obviously, banking was one area that was very problematic in 29, and that you expect would be a little different because
Yeah,
of
this
changes in the
time
industry?
the governments know that if they don't protect the banks, they go down very quickly. So, and also we have the federal uh, FDIC insurance for each account up to $100,000. So of course, we should not have an account which has more than $100,000. So you can spread your money out in different banks. So this time, I think bank CDs will be protected, and they are quite safe. And then, of course, short-term government bonds are also quite safe. Now, some people ask me about gold. Most likely there will be deflation in the next few months, so gold prices could go down a bit more. But at the end of this year, people might like to buy a little of gold as a hedge against tremendous uncertainty of 1999 and tremendous problems of next year. So gold perhaps will be a good buy at the end of this year.
In spite of deflation, you think that gold would likely hold value?
Well, when things start to fall apart, and I think dollar would collapse the next year, and when people don't know which currency to go to, then they would turn to gold.
So if the dollar collapses, then that means that the whole banking strategy is really just a short-term thing, but in the end, the crisis will catch up in spite of protections in the banking industry because the currency itself will lose value.
Well, yes, when the dollar collapses, foreign countries will withdraw their money from the United States, just as they did in Thailand. Remember, Thai economy was very, very strong as long as the foreign money was coming in. And American economy is also very strong because so much foreign money is coming in. But we have a huge foreign debt and a huge trade deficit, just as Thailand did. And the Thai economy collapsed almost overnight. So could our economy could do the same. And when foreigners don't have confidence in America, they could start withdrawing their money, and then the dollar would collapse. And a collapsing dollar eventually means inflation. At the end of '99 and beyond, we could have inflation in America, and that means gold would do well.
What does it actually mean for a whole economy to have massive failure in business? I mean, what?
Huge unemployment and or big fall in wages. One of the two things. Either you have a lot of unemployment or you have a huge fall in wages. That's what's happening in Asia. In some countries, unemployment is occurring sharply. In others, wages are falling, like in South Korea. In some countries, it's both. In Japan, it's both. So it's not a pretty picture, but then stock market bubbles have always ended up in this kind of pain. And the time to stop the timely action is to not to have the policies that foment greed. I mean, greed is always ever present, but the government policy should not encourage greed. That's my point. Markets will always be governed by greed, but the government should not be. So, but when the government policy starts to encourage greed, then the end result is a stock market bubble, which when crashes creates a lot of pain.
And of course, that fall in wages and a loss of jobs feeds into the crisis and exacerbates it.
That's right. As wages fall, the consumer demand falls even more, and as demand falls, the producers have to cut their output. That means more layoffs and so on. So this painful process can go on for 4 or 5 years before the dust settles and we come out.
Well, we have about 10 minutes left, and I'd certainly prefer to end on a happier note. Let's talk about that 4 or 5 years later.
Yes, I have again found in the past study of world history, I found that after the rule of money ended in society, then society heaved a huge sigh of relief. Crime went down, wages rose for everybody, not just for a privileged few, and the quality of life in general improved sharply because people decided that they needed the old-fashioned values or the old-fashioned virtues. So there was a lot more caring and compassion in society after the rule of money ended, because when money is dominant in a system, then there's a lot of materialism and selfishness in society, and that does not make people happy overall. So I'm predicting, I'm predicting a global golden age of the kind we have never seen in the past, because now we will live in one global village. So this time when the golden age arrives, it will bring smiles not only to Europe and America, but also to impoverished nations of Africa and Asia. So I'm very positive about the future of humanity, but I think but before we get to that pivotal point, there will be some pain.
I'm a little confused about your historical references. I mean, to my mind, the end of feudalism was the beginning of capitalism, and that's the time that Dickens was writing about England and the sweatshops, and obviously that's the time that Marx was writing and talking about the exploitation that was so rampant.
In my study of history, I find that there are three possible sources of political power. So I just don't look at economy only. And the three possible sources of political power are military, human intellect, and money. There doesn't seem to be any fourth source of political power. And accordingly, you find in history that sometime military dominates society, sometimes the intellectuals rule, and then sometimes people with money rule society. And there is a cycle of history that follows this pattern, that the rule of the military was followed by rule of intellectuals and then by the rule of the wealthy. And the rule of the wealthy ended up in a social revolution, and we went back to the rule of the military class, and then the rule of intellectuals again, followed again by the rule of the wealthy. So I've found this cycle operating in every civilization again and again, and that's why I was so confident that the rule of the military class in Soviet Union would not only fall by the year 2000, but that rule would be replaced by the rule of the bureaucrats and technocrats who are mostly educated individuals, and hence they fall in the category of the rule of the intellectuals. And so that's what happened in the Soviet system. Now people with education are ruling that society rather than the military class. So in history we find when the rule of money ended, the rule of army followed, and initially that rule was quite a bit better than the conditions under which money dominated society. So it's a different kind of historical system that I have followed than is traditionally offered by Marx and Hegel and others.
And what you're calling a golden age would be different because of a more democratic
Yes,
structure of power.
Now that's right. Now in the future we will have democracies, but in the United States, for instance, the presidents in the future would come from the army. That was also one forecast I had in my book, that before capitalism falls, a few army officers would become quite popular in the Western world, and I see the rise of Colin Powell and Norman Schwarzkopf as the fulfillment of my prophecy. So I feel that future presidents in America would come from the army, and they won't need any money to get elected. And that would be like Eisenhower or George Washington were army officers also. So that I call it a democracy of army officers. And we have a democratic system, but there is no money does not have any role to play in the election system. So I think that would be a golden age, because money will not be able to skew the tax laws in favor of the wealthy.
Now, would you anticipate that this cycle would repeat itself?
Oh, it has been repeating itself again and again over 5,000 years of history.
So, okay, but you're describing a golden age, but that golden age itself would have an end, and we would...
Well, there have been some golden ages in the past. Each time the rule of wealth ended. There have been some times when after the end of the rule of wealth it was a golden age. An example would be Queen Elizabeth Tudor, the part of the Tudor dynasty in England. After feudalism ended, the Tudors took over, and Queen Elizabeth gave England its golden age. And there are some other examples in other countries also. And so I feel that with the democratic tradition that we now have, we will have a worldwide and a beautiful golden age in the near future.
Okay, so you see progression in addition to the cycle.
Right. I see human evolution and social evolution creating a better system than what we have had in the past and today.
Okay, in the last couple of minutes, you've made reference to a couple of signs that people could see or recognize to anticipate that things are getting worse, and one of them was minor deflation.
The stock market is one thing. Another thing would be an extreme burst of optimism, which simply can't be explained rationally.
Well, we seem to have that now, don't we? With the
exactly.
stock market.
Now, yes.
Anything else?
I think most likely it will be very sudden, because we have so much optimism at this time that nobody really wants to listen to anything else. In fact, President Clinton's popularity goes up the more scandals he has, because he seems to be creating the stock market rise. That's what people think. Who is responsible? So I think it will be very sudden, and people will be caught off guard.
Well, with that, perhaps you could give the listeners that toll-free number again if they're interested in ordering a copy of your book.
The toll-free number is 1-800-888-9999.
And how much is the book?
The paperback version is $21, including the postage, and the hardback version is $27, including the postage.
Okay. Well, Dr. Batra, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for calling.
And I guess we'll all be watching with bated breath.
Okay.
And you've been listening to Hemispheres on KGNU Boulder, regular feature of Tuesday evenings. My name is Richard Curtis. I've been your host this evening. And coming up next, we have Corriente.